The night was silent until a gunshot echoed through the marble hallways of a Miami mansion. The newspapers would later call it the blood-stained mansion, a palace of fortune turned crime scene. On the floor, a man lay lifeless, surrounded by luxury, betrayal, and secrets that had finally come to light. His fortune couldn't save him from the only person he trusted. Hours before his death, Charles Whitmore, a real estate magnate, was celebrating a new multi-million-dollar deal. Guests toasted champagne beneath golden chandeliers, little imagining the party would end in tragedy. The man who commanded empires on Wall Street would lose everything, not to a sworn rival, but to an insider, someone he believed was loyal. The whispering began when a mysterious folder appeared on his desk, an object that shouldn't exist. Inside were doctored contracts, forged signatures, and a will hidden for years. Charles barely had time to read it before the lights flickered and the shadow of betrayal loomed behind him. It wasn't just about money. It was about life, death, and fatal secrets. Every empire has cracks, and every fortune holds mysteries. But Charles never imagined the conspiracy was so close, so lethal. He believed loyalty was enough. He trusted the truth would protect him. He was wrong. That night would turn his fortune into a trigger for lies, conspiracies, and a deadly betrayal. And as you follow this story, ask yourself, what would you do if your life, your fortune, and all your secrets were at risk? Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story about wealth. It's a warning. The final revelation will surprise you. Don't miss a single detail. The night was silent until a gunshot echoed through the marble corridors of a Miami mansion. Later, newspapers would call it the blood-stained mansion, a palace of fortune turned into a murder scene. On the floor, a man lay motionless, surrounded by luxury, betrayal, and secrets that had finally come to light. His fortune had not protected him from the wrong person. Hours before the crime, real estate magnate Charles Whitmore was celebrating a new multi-million-dollar deal. Guests toasted champagne beneath golden chandeliers, little imagining the evening would end in tragedy. The man who had built empires on Wall Street would lose everything, not to a sworn enemy, but to someone much closer, someone he would never suspect. It all began with a mysterious folder left on his desk. Inside were doctored contracts, forged signatures, and a will hidden for years. Charles barely had time to comprehend what he was reading when the lights flickered, revealing the shadow of a betrayal behind him. It wasn't just about money. It was about dangerous secrets capable of costing lives. Every empire harbors cracks, and every fortune hides mysteries. Charles believed loyalty was enough. He trusted the truth would keep him safe, but he was wrong. That night would turn his wealth into a curse, igniting a flame of conspiracies, lies, and deadly betrayal that no one could stop. And before we continue, I must tell you, this is just the first page of a dark story, where fortune, secrets, and betrayal go hand in hand. If you enjoy delving into real mysteries and fiction inspired by riches and fatal falls, follow this page right now. Because what happens from now on is just the beginning. Charles Whitmore wasn't just a millionaire, he was a symbol of American ambition. His fortune was built on New York skyscrapers, Miami resorts, and luxurious mansions that flaunted power. At 58, he no longer counted money in ordinary terms. He spoke of empires, but the greater the fortune, the greater the secrets it required keeping. Born into an ordinary family, Charles always bore the scar of poverty. Perhaps that's why he was obsessed with never being weak again. Those who knew him closely said his greatest fear wasn't losing money, but losing control. And ironically, it was precisely this control he would eventually hand over to the wrong person. His Miami mansion hosted lavish dinners with politicians, celebrities, and investors. But behind the crystal glasses, silent eyes watched every step. Secrets circulated like poison in golden cups. Charles's confidence was his blind spot. He believed he dominated everyone, but a betrayal was already underway. Among his frequent guests was a discreet woman, his personal assistant, lHe Marlowe. To everyone else, she was just a loyal employee, but behind the scenes, she was the guardian of safes, contracts, and confidential information. Charles would say, "lHe knows more about my fortune than my own children," a phrase that would later sound like a verdict. As he expanded his empire, Charles began to ignore signs of cracks in its foundations. Documents didn't match, funds quietly disappeared, and signed contracts returned with different contents. He blamed outside partners, but the truth lay within his own house. The fortune he protected with marble walls was being undermined from within. Little by little, his arrogance became fodder for his enemies. The more he celebrated public victories, the more vulnerable he left his private life. He didn't realize that the same assistant who organized his confidential files also had access to his greatest secrets. And secrets, when discovered, can kill. One night in his mansion, Charles discussed new acquisitions, but lHe watched silently. The gleam in her eyes wasn't admiration, it was calculation. She knew that a signature could change destinies, that a forgotten will could unlock coffers worth billions. Betrayal doesn't happen suddenly, it's cultivated slowly, like poison in small doses. Charles always believed he had control over everything, his children, his business, his image, but he didn't realize he was already being manipulated from within. While he toasted prosperity, the invisible threads of conspiracy tightened around his life. Fortune, power, and secrets were about to turn into curses. How often does a powerful man fall not to his sworn enemies, but to those he trusts most? That was the question that echoed off the marble walls of the blood-stained mansion. Charles's empire still stood, but each gilded celebration hid the harbinger of ruin. The clock had already begun ticking, and if you've made it this far, just imagine what's yet to come. This story is just beginning, and every detail matters. Turn the page now, because the next few minutes will reveal the first stirrings of the betrayal that would forever change Charles Whitmore's life. You won't want to miss the twist, because in the world of fortune, nothing lasts forever. And when loyalty is broken, the price is paid in blood. Charles Whitmore was called the Concrete King on Wall Street. His skyscrapers changed the New York skyline, and his fortune seemed indestructible. In Miami, his mansion was a showcase for the empire he built, but the brighter the glitter, the deeper the shadows. Secrets he thought buried were about to be reborn. The tycoon knew how to seduce investors. Meetings on yachts, rare wines, and golden promises. Those who saw him believed nothing could shake him. But within the gilded vaults of his mansion, hidden contracts and forgotten wills concealed the fragility of his fortune. It was wealth built on partial truths. While the world watched a growing empire, Charles hid his scars, risky investments, illegal clauses, and partnerships with dangerous men. lHe, his assistant, guarded every paper, every secret. For him, it was loyalty. For her, it was power. Those who hold the secrets control the fate of those who hold the fortune. Charles's children, Alexander and Grace, saw their father as untouchable, but they were already suspicious of his excessive trust in lHe. For them, there was something more, something that turned the loyal employee into a permanent shadow. Charles ignored it. He didn't realize that even within the family, the word betrayal was beginning to gain traction. At lavish parties, Charles flaunted his power. But when the music stopped, he was left alone with lHe and the open safes. A black folder rested on his desk, hidden clauses, dirty contracts, never-before-seen wills. The scent of old paper mixed with lHe's perfume was the trail of conspiracy within the mansion. The oil business in Houston further increased his fortune, but along with the profits came silent investigations. There were falsified contracts, shell companies, illegal donations. Charles believed he was protected, but every secret left a loose thread that someone could pull. And Elisa held them all in her hands. One night, during a meeting in Los Angeles, Charles received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single sentence written in red ink: "Even the greatest fortune can bleed." He laughed, believing it to be a threat from competitors. But Elisa watched silently, as if she already knew where the real stabs would come from. In the gilded halls of the mansion, Charles felt like a king. But that power came at a price. His secrets were scattered in safes and folders that few had access to. And if one of them were opened at the wrong time, his entire fortune would crumble. Betrayal is always more lethal when it begins at home. Elisa began to appear more often in discreet conversations. She received glances from investors, lawyers, and journalists. Who was this woman who knew so much? Charles believed her silence was proof of loyalty. But in silence, conspiracy also lies. Secrets kept too closely become weapons. The newspapers were already whispering about Whitmore's business dealings. Discreet headlines, hushed investigations, rumors of bribery. He laughed it off, believing nothing would harm his image. But the fortune he flaunted in the society columns was the same fortune that drew the attention of enemies and allies ready to betray. Elisa knew that Charles's original will contained explosive clauses. If revealed, it could destroy family relationships, spark inheritance wars, and expose shady dealings. Every time she touched that document, she felt the weight of a fortune capable of ruining lives. And the question grew: how long would she remain silent? While Charles smiled for the cameras, Elisa wrote in silence. She kept notes, hidden copies, confidences that could become currency. She didn't need to shoot to kill. All it took was an open secret, an exposed signature, a delivered clause, and the empire would bleed without a drop of blood. One night, Charles asked Elisa, "Would you stay with me if everything fell apart?" She smiled but didn't answer. The silence was more menacing than any words. Inside her, the betrayal was already complete. It was just waiting for the perfect moment to turn secrets into a deadly weapon. And the public following his career saw only glossy headlines. Whitmore buys new island. Whitmore doubles fortune in technology. But no one knew that, behind the mansion's doors, the real story was written in red ink. Fortune, secrets, and betrayal walked side by side. Each signed contract was a step closer to the abyss. Charles believed he was always one step ahead, but he didn't realize that Elisa already held all the cards. He trusted. She planned. And silently, the conspiracy game progressed. Assassination was only a matter of time. And have you ever noticed how the greatest empires fall, not because of a declared enemy, but because of blind trust in those who don't deserve it? This is the lesson that begins to unfold in the blood-stained mansion. The end was already written, but Charles still believed he was the author of his own story. If you want to discover how an entire fortune can be destroyed by a single secret, don't put this video down. Follow the page now and stay until the end, because the revelation that follows will prove every fortune has a price, and often that price is paid in blood. Night fell over Miami, its golden glow reflecting off the pool. Inside the mansion, Charles reviewed contracts in his private office, a space lined with wood and family portraits. On the desk, a black folder stood out. It hadn't been there the previous morning. It was the beginning of a secret that would change everything. Charles opened the folder and found yellowed pages, notary stamps, and recognizable signatures. The title read, "Will of Charles Whitmore, Original." His heart raced. He had signed a will before, but this one seemed older, full of clauses he never remembered agreeing to. The air in the room grew heavy. Among the clauses, one revealed that a large portion of his fortune was to be donated to an unknown foundation. The Marlowe Trust. Charles's eyes widened. The surname matched Elisa's. Coincidence? Or a betrayal planned from the start? The tycoon broke out in a cold sweat at the revelation. Elisa appeared discreetly at the door. "It's late, Mr. Whitmore. You'd need to rest." Charles tried to hide the papers, but she had already seen them. The silence between them was sharper than a knife. The assistant, who had kept his secrets for years, now seemed to hold the key to his downfall. He put the folder in the safe behind the gilded painting, but he knew it wasn't sufficient security against the woman who had access to everything. In that moment, a certainty grew within him. The mansion wasn't just his home, it was a gilded prison, watched over by unblinking eyes. At dinner that night, Alexander and Grace noticed their father's tension. Charles spoke little, his gaze distant. Elisa, on the other hand, calmly poured the wine, as if she controlled every detail of the scene. There was something in the air, an electricity that hinted that secrets were about to explode. Alexander, the eldest son, had been suspicious of Elisa's closeness for years. "Father, don't you think it's risky to trust an employee so much?" Charles countered. "She's more loyal than many blood relatives." Words that would echo like a curse. Grace watched silently, knowing that loyalty would cost her dearly. The next morning, a headline shocked the press. "Leaked documents suggest fraud in Whitmore Empire." Charles nearly dropped the newspaper. Those papers weren't in the public domain, unless someone very close had handed them over. Inside the mansion, the echoes of betrayal were beginning to resonate louder. Elisa entered his office and found Charles distraught. "What do you know about this?" he asked in a hard voice. She simply smiled, an enigmatic smile. "Secrets don't stay buried forever." It was the first time Charles saw in her eyes not submission, but power. It was terrifying. That night, he rummaged through the folder again. Among the papers, he found old handwritten letters signed by his now-deceased lawyer. The letters spoke of illegal dealings, sham contracts, and even mentions of political bribery. It was as if the past had returned to devour his fortune. Charles realized that Elisa had known everything for years. She was the guardian of his greatest secrets, but now she was using that power against him. Every forged signature, every hidden document was in her hands. The tycoon, who once ruled empires, now found himself held hostage by a woman who seemed invisible to the world. One night, during a meeting in New York, Charles received another anonymous message. A note left on his desk read, "The original will is no longer a secret." His hands trembled. Someone was playing against him from inside his own mansion, and there was no doubt who would benefit from this betrayal. Upon returning to Miami, the mansion seemed darker. The lights reflected off the marble, but the atmosphere was stifling. Charles no longer felt like he owned his own home. Every footstep echoed as if he were being watched. The wealth that had once given him security now felt like a minefield ready to explode. He tried to confront Elisa, but she merely replied, "Everything I did was for you, but perhaps you never understood the price of the fortune you built." Charles remained silent. The words were laced with venom, but also with truth. After all, his fortune truly had been built on dark secrets. Grace began to notice safes being opened, folders moved, documents disappearing. "Dad, someone's been tampering with your files." Charles shook his head, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But deep down, he already sensed that the blood-stained mansion was only a matter of time away. Alexander discreetly hired a private investigator. Within days, he received reports showing Elisa's nocturnal encounters with unknown lawyers. One of them was an inheritance specialist. What was she planning? With each discovery, the word betrayal became more deeply engraved in everyone's minds. At a lavish party while toasting investors, Charles received a photo sent to his cell phone. It showed the safe in his office open with the original will on display. The message read, "You don't control anything anymore." His face paled in front of everyone, but he covered it with a toast. The Whitmore empire still seemed intact to the world, but inside it was about to crumble. Elisa, silent as ever, watched from the shadows. Her every gesture was calculated. Every look, a sentence. Charles was beginning to understand that the assassination would not be just physical. His fortune was already being secretly killed. Have you noticed how the true enemy never attacks head-on, but from behind? Keep following, because from now on, the conspiracy will become irreversible. Follow the page now, because the next step will show how fortune, secrets, and betrayal intertwine in a path of no return. Charles spent sleepless nights sifting through papers, calling lawyers, trying to find a way out. But each call was interrupted by mysterious messages. "Don't fight the inevitable," one read. The feeling of being hunted within his own fortune gnawed at him. The once unbeatable tycoon was on the verge of paranoia. At a private dinner, Grace sensed her father's nervousness. "Dad, what's going on?" He avoided answering, but Elisa intervened with practiced calm. "Some secrets shouldn't be shared at the dinner table." Grace eyed her suspiciously, understanding that her assistant's loyalty had already turned into a threat. Alexander pressed his father to come clean. "Are we in danger? Could the empire collapse?" Charles stood, slamming his crystal goblet on the table. "No one will destroy what I've built." The remark echoed, but even he knew it was wishful thinking. His secrets were already in the wrong hands. The private investigator brought new evidence, copies of secret meetings between Elisa and a notary. In the images, papers resembling the original will were being handled. Alexander could hardly believe his eyes. "She's not your assistant, father. This is your sentence." Charles, however, refused to fully accept the betrayal. The next morning, Charles found his office safe ajar. The will was still there, but a black envelope had been left on top of the documents. Inside was a single photo, his own mansion, seen from the outside, with the caption written in red, "This house is no longer yours." He began to realize that his life was a chessboard controlled by invisible hands. He tried to push Elisa away, but she smiled coldly. "You wouldn't survive a day without me." The threat was implicit. It wasn't just professional dependence, it was a psychological prison. Charles was a prisoner of his own fortune. In the following days, Whitmore Enterprises' shares plummeted after rumors of corruption surfaced. Investors withdrew millions, and newspapers spun every detail. For society, Charles remained the target of envy. For those with insider knowledge, it was only a matter of time before the downfall turned into public ruin. Elisa, increasingly present, seemed unfazed. She controlled schedules, accessed bank accounts, and coordinated meetings. Alexander was yelling at his father, "Can't you see she's taking over everything?" But Charles, torn between fear and fascination, continued to allow it. Betrayal no longer needed to hide. Grace tried to confront Elisa privately. "What do you want from our family?" Elisa simply replied, "It's not about wanting, it's about deserving. And in the end, only one of us will get the fortune." The calm tone made Grace tremble. It was the first time she realized they were facing a mortal enemy. The atmosphere inside the mansion changed. What was once a luxurious palace now felt like a maze of conspiracy. The gilded walls echoed with arguments, the silent corridors hid secrets. Each night, the sound of the safe being opened or the sight of moving papers fueled the family's psychological terror. Charles decided to call a meeting with all the heirs and their lawyers. He wanted to clarify the will, settle the matter once and for all. But when he opened the folder in front of everyone, the pages had been swapped. The original will was gone. In its place were contracts incriminating him in multi-million-dollar frauds. The room erupted in screams. "This is a setup," Charles yelled, but no one believed him. Alexander stared at Elisa, who remained motionless, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Grace wept, fearing the family name would be destroyed. The decades-old empire seemed to crumble before a few sheets of paper. The next morning, the press surrounded the mansion. Headlines screamed, "Whitmore investigated for fraud and hidden will." Reporters pushed microphones through the gates. It was the beginning of the public trial. The blood-stained mansion still had no body, but it was already marked as a scene of ruin. Charles, desperate, tried to negotiate. "Elisa, we can work it out. I'll give you whatever you want." But she replied coldly, "I already have what I want. Your trust. And with that, I don't need anything else." Her look was like someone who had already signed a living murder warrant. That night, Charles isolated himself in his office. Walls seemed to close in on him. The fortune that had always protected him now condemned him. The black briefcase, the safe, the contracts, everything was a trap he'd built with his own hands. For the first time, he understood that he might not survive to see the next dawn. And you? Have you noticed that the greatest downfalls don't happen from external blows, but from hands we trust too much? This is the turning point that changes everything. Follow this page now, because the next act will show how the conspiracy turns into open warfare. Charles's fortune is no longer safe, because in the end, fortune, secrets and betrayal always come at a price. And that price at Whitmore Mansion will be paid in blood. Since the public scandal, Charles has been surrounded by distrust. Lawyers knocked on his door daily, investors called in panic, and his children demanded explanations. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and luxury, had become a suffocating bunker. What he feared most was happening. His life was on display. Elisa, however, maintained a frightening serenity. She walked around the house as if she owned the place, controlling employees, documents and schedules. Grace began to feel chills as she realized every family decision passed through her assistant's cold eyes. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was a fait accompli. Alexander searched for evidence against her, but with each attempt, the trail was erased. Phones disappeared, security cameras were mysteriously disabled, reports vanished. It seemed the mansion itself was conspiring against him. The air grew heavy, and every shadow reminded him that dark secrets were being revealed. The parties that once celebrated the Whitmore Empire ceased. Silence reigned in the halls, interrupted only by hushed discussions. Charles, sitting in his gilded room, stared at the locked safe, knowing it no longer held just fortune, but proof of his ruin. The gold I once protected now weighed like chains. Reporters camped outside the mansion, broadcasting every move live. Headlines spoke of a deadly betrayal and an inevitable downfall. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of power, had become a cruel joke. For every supporter, there was a detractor, and the fortune seemed to crumble before society's eyes. One night, Charles heard footsteps in the office. Armed with a revolver inherited from his father, he rushed in, but found only the safe ajar. Inside, the will was gone again. In its place, a short note. "Trust kills." He fell back into his chair, realizing he was already being manipulated like a puppet. Grace secretly began recording conversations. She wanted evidence against Elisa. In one of them, she captured a clip of her assistant speaking to someone on the phone. "The empire is already ours. All that's missing is the final signature." When she showed it to her father, Charles paled. His fortune was already considered an inheritance, even before his death. Alexander decided to act violently. "If we don't stop this woman, she'll destroy us." Charles, exhausted, hesitated. But the mansion was already the scene of an invisible war. Doors locked by themselves, servants suddenly disappeared, and forged contracts appeared like ghosts. The conspiracy had taken physical form within the house. Charles tried to negotiate with lHe again. "Tell me what you want, and I'll give it to you." She simply replied, "It's not about money, it's about power. Your fortune is just the beginning." For the first time, the tycoon understood that he wasn't dealing with a common blackmailer, but with someone who had been plotting his downfall for years. A dinner between lawyers ended in scandal. Anonymous documents were handed over, revealing secret accounts in the Caribbean linked to Charles's name. He denied it to everyone, but doubts crept in. His closest allies began to abandon him, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Nights became unbearable. The wind beat against the mansion's windows, but Charles swore he heard voices in the hallways. Treason, murder, secrets. The psychological echo destroyed him. The external empire might crumble, but the internal ruin was even more cruel. He was no longer his own master. Grace found an old letter in her father's room. Written by the dead lawyer, it read, "If this document comes to light, know that your fortune will be your condemnation." She wept silently, understanding that the end was near. The mortal betrayal was not just of lHe, but of the entire story Charles had built. The sons began to fear for their father's life. Alexander warned him, "It's not just money, it's your life." Charles replied wearily, "My life has always been my money." The statement, though arrogant, carried the truth. He had become confused with his own fortune, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, lHe formed discreet alliances with journalists. Documents leaked in calculated doses, always at the right time. Each report was like a new knife thrust into Charles's image. It was a slow but sure assassination. The public, fascinated, watched the downfall like one watching a spectacle. A former partner, Jonathan Blake, appeared out of nowhere. "Charles, let me help." But the tycoon knew Blake never acted without self-interest. Perhaps he was another traitor disguised as an ally. The conspiracy no longer knew boundaries. Friends and enemies were mingling, and the blood-stained mansion was a stage for all of them. One morning, the pool was dyed red. It wasn't real blood, but dye spilled overnight. Essentially, a message written on plastic, "Every empire sinks." Charles collapsed. The mansion had become a theater of psychological terror. The next act could indeed be a real murder. Even so, he still tried to keep up appearances. In brief interviews, he would smile and say, "Everything is under control." But inside, he was no longer in control. The empire he had spent decades building was being destroyed in a matter of weeks, and every secret revealed was another nail in his coffin. Do you realize how the fortune that shines before everyone can be the same poison that corrodes within? Stay tuned, because the next twist will reveal not only betrayal, but preparation for the final blow. Follow the page, because Charles's ultimate downfall has already begun. The charity auction night began with violins under the main chandelier. Guests in formal attire paraded through gilded halls. Cameras captured expensive smiles and calculated toasts. Charles Whitmore walked around like a tired king. lHe, from a distance, observed every gesture with clinical precision. The opening speech extolled philanthropy and legacy. Charles promised a new hospital wing named after him. The audience applauded, mesmerized by the glow of fortune. Alexander and Grace exchanged tense glances, watching lHe closely. Jonathan Blake arrived late with a snake-like smile. In the side room, a table displayed historical documents. Among old photos lay a black folder. Charles recognized her from afar and turned pale. He whispered to a security guard, "Nobody touches that." lHe was already walking in the opposite direction, silently. The musicians changed the tone to something more dramatic. In every corner, whispers rose like smoke. Reporters sniffed out rumors, prepared for the coup. The walls seemed to listen, absorbing ancient secrets. The mansion breathed like an animal about to attack. Charles called a break and called the committee together. Lawyers sat around the mirrored table. "Let's close early," he said dryly. "There are fake documents circulating around here." Elisa just folded her hands, patient. A waiter brought glasses. One fell and shattered. The crystal scratched the marble like a warning. The room froze for an uncomfortable second. Charles felt his heart pound with forebodings. The sound echoed like a rehearsed shot. Jonathan smiled and revealed envelopes. Evidence of diversion to offshore accounts. Photos, extracts, signatures exploded onto the table. The lawyers choked on their own silence. Charles shouted, "Set up! This is treason!" Elisa stood up with studied calm. "There is no setup when the truth speaks." She opened the black folder in front of everyone. The original will shone under the lights. Last will, before being adulterated. Grace took a shaky step forward. "Dad, is this real?" Charles looked at the document like a mirror. He saw his own ambition reflected in cold letters. His world shrank to a paragraph. The video generator lit up side screens. Images of contracts paraded as a sentence. Names, dates, stamps, every stitch tied together. The audience became a court without warning. Donations turned to bitter laughter. "The Marlowe Trust inherits 40%, Jonathan read. The guests will gasp in a restrained chorus. Elisa didn't blink, still as marble. Alexander punched the table in indignation. Grace held back her tears with dignity. Charles stepped forward to snatch the papers. Security guards hesitated, unsure who to obey. The music stopped, leaving the air bare. Who rules when the king wavers? The hall smelled the scent of falling. From the hallway, an antique clock struck 10 times. Each chime sounded like a countdown. Charles felt the mansion shrink around him. Walls melted in waves of panic. Fortune turned into a golden cage. Lights flickered. The chandelier went out for a second. Screams tore through the dark hall. A bang cut through the night. The blood-stained mansion fulfilled the prophecy. When the lights came back on, chaos ensued. Dropped glasses, glass everywhere. A body in the center broke the order. Charles on the floor, eyes empty. Silence drenched in luxury and fear. Grace fell to her knees and screamed. Alexander ran, hands shaking. "Call an ambulance, now!" The blood drew a line on the marble. Fortune watched, mute and cold. Elisa stood there, expressionless. "May God have mercy," someone muttered. Jonathan discreetly picked up an envelope. Cameras pointed, hungry for tragedy. The whole world would watch the murder. Security guards cordoned off the area. Police were called with top priority. A reporter narrated in real time. "Tycoon Whitmore has been shot." The news spread across the city in minutes. An expert touched the broken cup. "There is a recent impression," he said, writing it down. Another collected a capsule near the piano. "Single shot, lateral direction." Eyes searched for an invisible shooter. Alexander stared at Elisa, eyes blazing. "Where were you when the lights went out?" "Exactly where everyone could see me," he replied. She didn't tremble. She didn't swerve. Control remained in her hands. Grace pointed at Jonathan. "Why did you bring this today?" "Transparency," he said sweetly. "Or fear," the detective countered. The lies already seemed like borrowed courage. On the floor, the black briefcase lay open. Pages of the will flew like birds. Spilled secrets became a public spectacle. Fortune stood naked before strangers. Betrayal smells like wet paper. The police led everyone to the smaller hall. "Cell phones on the tray, please." Watches, pens, small pocket safes. Everything became suspicious under pale neon. Luxury was now criminal evidence. The chief detective called for absolute silence. "Who controlled the lights?" The technician stammered, pale. "Generator failure, sir. Timer changed." Someone predicted the dark millimeter by millimeter. The butler reported something disturbing. A service door was left unlocked. The hallway camera went out at the exact minute. The house map showed a hole. The conspiracy knew every shortcut. Elisa asked to sit down. "I'm dizzy," she said in a thread. The paramedic checked the blood pressure. She craned her neck again. The steel mask was intact. Alexander slammed the table furiously. "My father trusted you." "Your father trusted his own shadow," she said, "and shadows collect taxes." The sentence chilled the atmosphere. The detective approached the shattered cup. "Who knocked this over before the shot?" The waiter raised his hand, startled. "I tripped, sir. It was an accident." Nothing seemed like an accident that night. Jonathan suggested ending the event. "Respect to the deceased," he declared theatrically. The police firmly refused. "No one leaves until we check everything." The show had to go on in the dark. Grace asked for a minute to speak. "My father made a mistake, but he didn't deserve this." She stared at Elisa without blinking. Who would inherit upon his death? The question opened another wound. The lawyer announced the next bombshell. The will would supersede the current advice. Elisa Marlowe would have a lifetime seat. A murmur went through the room. Fortune seemed to choose its own guardian. The detective asked for energy records, identified a peak 3 minutes earlier. Someone switched on an external circuit. The plan indicated the east garden. Damp floor, half-erased footprints. They followed the trail to the greenhouse. The glass sweated, plants dripped. Behind expensive vases, a coat, smell of gunpowder and expensive perfume. The pocket hid thin gloves. Back in the hall, maximum tension. Alexander was trembling, almost voiceless. "This ends today." Elisa crossed her legs, unfazed. "Only when you understand the price." The detective displayed the gloves he had found. "Does anyone want to explain?" No one moved an inch. The room turned into a frozen painting. The clock struck 11. A message arrived on a seized cell phone. "Delivery complete, as agreed." The number was unknown and cold. Jonathan swallowed hard, eyes flickering. The detective wrote it down without comment. Grace touched her father's face, devastated. "What did you hide from us?" Silence answered for him. Buried secrets call for revenge, and revenge exacts high interest. The TV turned on and displayed the headline, "Murder in the House of Fortune." Drones flew over the enclosed gardens. The city judged live, mercilessly. The blood-stained mansion has become a theater. The detective called Elisa alone. "Why the Marlowe Trust?" "Because no one gives without receiving power." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he smiled like someone who wins early. Alexander stared at the covered body. He swore something that only he heard. "I will expose you all." His fist clenched like stone. The lineage demanded courage from the air. On the terrace, the wind brought salt from the sea. The city shone indifferently in mourning. A helicopter cut through the sky, hungry. Blue lights painted the lawn. The fortune became breaking news. The detective gathered everyone together again. Someone cut the power in the garden. Close-range shooting, right hand. The killer knew the house by heart, and it didn't come from outside. Elisa met Jonathan's gaze. A second, maybe less than that. Enough to spark new suspicions, enough to prove nothing concrete. Secret survived the bullet. The piano still had a red stain. It wasn't paint, it was spilled wine, as in the omen of the dyed pool. The symbol closed a silent circle. The house spoke in blood metaphors. The detective held the capsule high in the air. 1 bullet, 1 dead, 4 suspects. Reason? Luck. Tool, secrets, path, treason. If you followed this far, stay. The truth always finds the right door. Follow the page to see each piece fall, because the next few minutes will break masks, and nothing protects from the last revelation. Dawn landed like a crow on the roof. Inside, open eyes were afraid to blink. The mansion took a deep breath before the next blow. The climax gave away the body, not the soul. The killer was still among them. The next morning dawned cold over Miami. The mansion's fences were covered with flowers and candles. Reporters broadcast non-stop from outside the gates. "Murder in the House of Fortune," repeated headlines. Morning was already a spectacle broadcast in real time. Inside, police officers catalogued every detail of the scene. The blood on the marble was photographed from all angles. The stained piano became symbolic evidence. Each broken glass seemed to tell a story. The mansion was a living archive of deadly betrayal. Alexander assumed the posture of a furious heir. "I won't let the Whitmore name die like this." But his voice sounded more like revenge than pain. Grace, nearby, held childhood photos. For her, the fortune was not worth as much as her father. Charles's body was taken away discreetly. A white sheet covered the last image of him. Outside, drones competed for the best shot. The press helicopter followed the procession. Even death was consumed as a spectacle. At the morgue, doctors confirmed the cause: single shot, short range, planned execution. The town murmured, "Who killed the tycoon?" Theories were emerging every hour on the networks. The blood-stained mansion had become a myth. Meanwhile, Elisa gave calculated testimony. "I was in the hall, surrounded by witnesses." The detective took notes, but didn't confirm anything. His calm seemed rehearsed in mirrors. Secrets remained hidden behind cold eyes. Jonathan tried to distance himself from the scandal. "I was just a consultant that night." But cameras showed him exchanging glances with Elisa. The police noticed the detail, recording it in silence. The conspiracy still breathed within the case. The funeral was lavish and quiet. Authorities, business people, and curious onlookers competed for space. Speeches extolled the visionary man, but the whispers spoke of corruption and betrayal. Even death did not cleanse his secrets. Grace cried non-stop beside the coffin. "He was my father before he was a tycoon." Alexander kept his fist clenched, vowing revenge. Elisa, at the back of the church, did not shed a tear. His fixed gaze seemed to already be looking into the future. The fortune was officially up for grabs. Lawyers discussed clauses of the will. The name Marlowe Trust loomed large. Each heir feared losing everything at once. Betrayal was now also a legal role. The media was unforgiving. Talk shows explored the case in prime time. Luxury, secrets, and murder became a permanent headline. Hashtags went viral in minutes around the world. The Whitmore empire was consumed by digital mobs. In the neighborhood, neighbors commented on the decline. "Fortune doesn't buy loyalty," said one. "He trusted too much in someone he shouldn't have," said another. The legacy became a warning about blind trust. The moral was already written on the sidewalks. The police cleared the house after 48 hours, but the mansion seemed haunted. Glass reflected ghosts of parties past. Carpets kept the footsteps of dirty secrets. It was now a symbol of a corrupt empire. On the company's board, investors rebelled. Stocks plummeted like an avalanche. The Whitmore brand has become synonymous with fraud. Fortune built over decades evaporated in days. The betrayal of the market completed the work. Alexander tried to take control, but his anger alienated allies. Grace begged for calm and strategy. He just screamed, "I'll destroy them all." Mourning became a weapon of war. Elisa, in silence, collected invisible gains. His political connections grew every week. The surname Marlowe appeared in discreet newspapers. She had turned secrets into capital, and capital in almost untouchable power. The city asked, who really inherited the fortune? The answer wasn't in safes or contracts. I was backstage, between looks and silences. Betrayal had already crowned its victor. The truth, however, still waited to be revealed. After the funeral, Whitmore Mansion fell silent, as if every wall had witnessed more than it could bear. The servants disappeared, the gates were locked, and the gilded luxury became a cell. The echo of past laughter was replaced by lonely footsteps. Alexander began to wander the halls like a living ghost, a glass of whiskey always in his hand. He believed he could hear his father's voice in every corner of the house, as if the secrets had never been buried. His anger mingled with paranoia, transforming the heir into a prisoner of his own fortune. Grace was trying to maintain her sanity, but she couldn't bear the weight of her tarnished family name. The blood-stained mansion became a cruel nickname in the headlines, repeated by strangers on the street. Every time she turned on the television, she saw her father's face amid scandals and theories, as if he were still on eternal trial. The fortune, once celebrated, had become a burden. Safes filled with documents now served as reminders that every dollar was bought with treachery. Alexander screamed to himself, "We don't inherit wealth, we inherit a curse." And each night, the silence of the mansion seemed to respond, suffocating, confirming his sentence. Elisa had disappeared from the news, but not from their memory. The assistant's shadow lingered in every rummaged-through drawer, every lost key, every tampered-with contract. It was as if the conspiracy still breathed within the house, making the heirs unwitting guardians of secrets they could not control. Paranoia grew. Doors slammed without wind, lights flickered without electrical failure, and Alexander began to believe someone was still watching his every move. "She's still here," he murmured, locking himself in his office. Grace, frightened, no longer knew whether she feared Elisa, external enemies, or her own ruined brother. In the main room, Charles's gilded portrait hung askew, revealing the empty safe behind it. Where wills and contracts had once been, only dust now remained. It was a cruel symbol. Nothing that had been stored had survived. The entire fortune had been turned to paper ash and dried blood. The press continued to exploit the tragedy. Talk shows spoke of a curse. Books began to be written, and even movie writers approached the children to sell the story. What was mourning for them was entertainment for the world. The mansion had become an eternal stage for betrayal and spectacle. Alexander was no longer sleeping. He sat alone in the dark room, surrounded by empty bottles, repeating broken phrases about revenge. "I'll expose them all. I'll expose them all." The gilded mansion was now nothing more than a psychological prison, where every shadow reminded him that his fortune was tainted by murder. Grace, exhausted, abandoned the house after a nervous breakdown. "Let this die," she said before leaving. Alexander was left alone, surrounded by ghosts and memories, becoming the guardian of an inheritance no one else wanted. The luxurious, silent marble mansion made him a hostage to his own family name. The gilded prison was complete. The luxury that once inspired envy was now punishment. Fortune, secrets, and betrayal formed invisible chains that kept Alexander chained to ruin. The Whitmore Empire, once a symbol of power, ended like a glass tomb, shiny on the outside, empty and haunted within. The main room of the Whitmore mansion was once again lit by flashbulbs. Reporters streamed through the gate, cameras capturing every detail. The same marble floor where Charles had fallen was displayed as a scene for macabre tourism. The beginning and the end connected. The place of glory was also the stage for destruction. Alexander, now alone, watched the crowd through the window. He finally understood the weight of his father's words. Fortune is a prison. His life was reduced to watching empty coffers, haunted by memories that would never rest. The blood-stained mansion was the eternal echo of secrets no one would erase. A television documentary announced the fall of Whitmore, fortune, secrets, and betrayal. The images showed parties, contracts, the explosion at the auction, and finally the body on the floor. The cycle was complete. The man who believed in the power of wealth had been devoured by it, and his own family was paying the price. On the last recorded night, Alexander turned off all the lights and walked to the empty vault. He touched the cold walls and whispered, "We inherit nothing but a curse." The narrative loop was complete. The same golden painting that hid fortune now held only silence and dust. The mansion was his prison. And so the story ended as it began. A gunshot, a body, and a fortune destroyed from within. The moral echoed like a sentence. Secrets never stay buried, betrayal always exacts its toll, and greed turns palaces into tombs. The Whitmore mansion was a reminder that every empire of blood ends in dust. In the end, Charles Whitmore's fortune was remembered not for its skyscrapers or mansions, but for the blood spilled in its halls. The world forgot his business dealings, but never his downfall. This proves that wealth without honor is just a sandcastle waiting for the tide. The blood-stained mansion became an eternal symbol of greed. No matter how many coffers a man fills, if the secrets are bigger than his soul, they will eventually devour him. Charles's legacy was not power, but a warning. No one wins when treachery is at the table. The children inherited only ruin. Elisa disappeared like a shadow, taking with her more questions than answers. And the public learned a lesson. Blind trust can be as deadly as a weapon. The true inheritance isn't money, it's the weight of the secrets we choose to keep. The moral is clear. Fortune attracts brilliance, but also darkness. Buried secrets resurface, betrayal exacts its toll, and greed always wins in the short term, until it exacts the ultimate price. Charles Whitmore's story is a cruel reminder that empires don't fall to distant enemies, but to those we call near. And if you've stuck around this far, you already know this is just one of the many mysteries we reveal on this channel. Stories of fortune, secrets, and betrayal that show how power can turn to tragedy. Follow our page now and don't miss the next episodes, because the next empire to fall could be even greater.